Welcome back. I feel like for full disclosure, much as what we do with CME, I should disclose my biases. I don't have any biases in terms of grant funding or whatnot, but I am a neurologist and psychiatrist, public health person, and I'm very happy to introduce these speakers. I also represent ISPU, one of the co-sponsors of this organization, Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. As Asim outlined, there are several stakeholders, several consumers, as he put it, in the endeavor of Islamic bioethics. We heard about the bioethicist perspective, we heard about the Islamic scholars' perspective, and certainly there's a perspective of the healthcare professionals. So I think it's appropriate that our first speaker is a medical anthropologist who studies healthcare professionals and doctors in particular and their relationships to patients. Shireen Hamdi is a assistant professor of anthropology at Brown University and the Qutayba Al-Ghanam assistant professor of social sciences at Brown University. She is an emerging expert in the fields of biomedicine, environmental health. She has already won an award, a prestigious Rudolf Virchow Award for the Society of Medical Anthropology for her work titled When the State and Your Kidney Fail, Political Ideologies in an Egyptian Dialysis Unit. Her book is upcoming. Her book called Our Bodies Belong to God, Islam Organ Transplants and the Struggle for Human Dignity in Egypt will be coming out fall 2011. And she has been recognized by the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton for her scholarship, and she's going to be a fellow there next year. So it's really my pleasure to introduce to you Shireen Hamdi.
Thanks for that introduction, Dr. Hamid. What do I do?
I'm sorry, I should have said that.
Aha. Okay, so we've heard this morning a lot of perspectives from medical and philosophical, religious perspectives, and I'm going to give a much more grounded social science perspective about how the clinical encounter produces a number of bioethical dilemmas, how religious scholars and doctors actually communicate, not just in the ideal, how they're supposed to, like we saw that nice roadmap that Sheikh Ali Goma gave, but how do they in reality engage and understand each other or not understand each other, and how do patients come to make meaningful religious pronouncements. And I hope you see the value of the social scientific perspective. I think that it's actually quite crucial to illuminate and complicate a lot of what we heard earlier this morning. So I'm going to begin based on my research on organ transplantation in Egypt to talk about, continue the conversation about brain death and organ transplantation. So again, how do we assess the Islamic position on a new medical issue? We've heard a bit about that that's problematic because there are a lot of different views, right? Who gets to decide, etc. How does this happen in actuality? And what I would rather ask is what makes us want the Islamic position on a new medical issue? I think that's important too. So first, ask and not assume who is benefiting from the particular medical intervention. And that's going to be very specific according to different cases, right? Who might benefit in one room down the ward might be different. At what costs? Under what changing conditions, and at the expense of whom, and who gets to evaluate these things. So very rich ethnographic, social descriptions are really needed to bring out some of the social patterns so that we can analyze why certain resources are flowing in particular directions and how people ex post facto legitimate them using religious or ethical language. So a bit of the context to set the scene. The Egyptian Society of Nephrology in 1996 says that less than 3% of patients who are in terminal end-stage kidney failure actually receive transplants. Now, the amount of print in the Egyptian media spent discussing this issue will really stagger you. And then when you see in perspective how few people who are on, and these are just the kidney failure patients who happen to have been diagnosed and who are on hemodialysis. So imagine the tens of thousands that we're not catching who are underdiagnosed every year, and the numbers have been increasing. So in 1976, just to give a bit of background, was the first kidney transplant in Egypt. And it was when a mother donated a kidney to her daughter who was in end-stage renal failure. It was successful. And thereafter, kidney transplants were performed from living donors. Now, those very early pioneering doctors tried to legislate and get a national organ transplant program starting. And we have a puzzle here where Egypt was one of the first nations in the region to begin with transplantation and then really lagged behind in terms of legislation. The major stumbling block to the legislation, the issue of brain death. So first, I will tell you, for the people who actually are receiving kidney transplants, again, the numbers really increase. And a lot of people have attributed the stumbling block to Sheikh Mohammed Mutawalli Sha'rawi, not an official mufti or scholar, but an Azhari graduate, a very prominent sheikh who, because of television media, had a very prominent voice in Egyptian society. And at one point, he was in a televised interview, and somebody asked him, what do you think about organ transplants? And he said, well, how could you donate something that doesn't belong to you? Surely that is haram. And it was such an absolutist statement that it really took people off guard. They weren't expecting it. Doctors really condemned him. He was very roundly condemned in the media for taking this extreme position and refusing to elaborate on it. So people would say, well, what if the person's gonna live? What if it's a mother to her child? What if it's a brother? And it didn't matter what the context was. He would refuse to engage in the particularities of any case. And all he would do was give an absolutist statement. So because of that very bizarre position that he took, very not conforming to the way, for example, a mufti would reason his position, it was extremely condemned and marginalized in the press, and he was single-handedly blamed for the obstacle to legislation. Now, I'm going to complicate that picture because I don't think that that's actually what happened, but at least on the discursive level of the media, he himself was personally blamed for causing an obstacle for legislation of transplants. So here I go into the dialysis clinics in Egypt for about 2 years. I did a longitudinal study of people in dialysis treatment. As I began interviewing people in their homes, I also interviewed all of their doctors and religious scholars and the media and the legislation. So this was like a very, very large, in-depth research account that I did. And I found, to my surprise, that time and again I would hear patients who could benefit from kidney transplantation refuse it on the grounds that, and if you would ask them, well, why don't you want to pursue a transplant? Their answer was, because the body belonged to God. And so here I think is a bit of my challenge to Dr. Brody. In your wonderful nuancing of Rawls' idea of the public, I think there's an overestimation maybe of people's ability to articulate how they can come to a religious position and to be able to link that to their religious understanding because of how permeable religion is with all of these other influx of factors that they're getting, media, etc. And so they didn't really have a very elaborate explanation for what was going on. Okay, but then, I stick around for 2 years, I start to uncover other things. Toxicity was a major explanatory factor that patients and physicians would use to explain the rapid increase in cases of kidney failure throughout the Egyptian countryside. And indeed, with the privatization of a lot of multinational corporations, including pesticide companies, there has been this particular factory is in violation of the law, which is not to dispose of toxic waste on agricultural land. And there's numerous examples. I got into huge trouble for taking this picture, so I can't show you all the evidence. But this is a huge concern. to clinicians who will find patterns that patients who come from the same clinic or same village that's close to a facility that is not properly disposing of toxic waste fall into kidney and liver failure. Okay. Etiology of renal failure in Egypt, these are the official numbers. You'll see that the highest is what they call unknown etiology. And this provides clinicians and patients ripe cause to attribute these factors to pollutants. So what does that mean? And also to iatrogenic factors like surgeons doing a botched operation on a kidney stone, for example. Okay, in conjunction with that, we have numerous reports of a black market in Egypt. And these reports are being directed at the President of the Republic, not anymore, but President Mubarak. This is a particular statement to Mubarak saying, look at what you've done. Not only do you not care for your own citizens, you leave them to be sold off bit by bit. This is a very popular film where the hero has his kidney stolen, and he addresses his grievance at the end of the film to a portrait of Mubarak hanging in the courthouse where he says, "Are you satisfied? We've been robbed down to our flesh." So if you ask people why are they reluctant to pursue kidney transplant, you can't stop at the because my body belongs to God or because it's not my right to take a body part from somebody else. It's not enough to just listen to the words. You have to go actually deeper and think what's unarticulatable, especially in an incredibly repressive, politically repressive society. And what I found is that people are attributing their disease to environmental toxins, and so by that logic, why would I subject my brother by taking a kidney from him and leave him in the same corrupt environment that caused me ill when I was with 2 kidneys, right? Or people would say things like, this is an exploitative practice that physicians are making a lot of money off the backs of the poor. It had a very negative connotation. It was not the miraculous gift of life as in American media, okay? So, oh boy, I haven't even gotten to the brain dead. So given that there's a lot of problems with living kidney donation, and then certain patterns would emerge within the families of, for example, brothers getting kidneys but not sisters, husbands getting kidneys but not wives, women doing all that they can in order to get kidneys so that they can protect their reproductive viability for marriage. There were a lot of, it's not as if there was just the bad commercial market and then the sanctity of the family where altruism reigns. There were pressures in both of these. So given all of these huge problems, why wouldn't we consider cadaveric procurement? And I just want to say that there's a lot of talk about, well, we all know that a donor isn't harmed by a kidney, as if that's a universal fact. And if there's resistance to the idea of living donation, then it must be because of cultural, ethical, religious attitudes. And that is a really false and dangerous dichotomy to put the medicine on one side and the society on another. Because if you want to say that a donor is not going to be hurt by extraction of a kidney, you have to be sure that the surgical skills are the same in the places, the anesthesia available is of the same quality, that person has recuperative time after the operation. There's a whole host of factors that go into the efficacy of a surgery. We can't just black box medical efficacy. We have to look at it as contextually as we look at social and ethical responses. Okay, we do find cases where people do get kidney transplants. This one guy got it from his dad, and then he was able to get married, and he holds up proudly a picture of his twin boy and girl. So one wonders, why can't we get cadaveric procurement? There are all of these problems. There's a huge number of patients in kidney and liver failure, and there's a lot of problems with procuring organs from the living, including a black market and fears about the harm to the donor. Well, this has been the stumbling block. Why? Okay, so there's 2 misconceptions that we have to debunk, and you always have to do this when you're talking about Islam. It's like you have to shovel off the bad stuff before you even get to the good stuff. But let's look at the misconceptions. This is doctors versus sheikhs. This rehearses the same argument about science versus religion, right? And the next misconception is that there's the good liberal muftis who allow these kinds of things, and then the bad ones who don't. Sheikh Sharawi was depicted as the bad guy who said no, and then Tantawi, who's the Mubarak endowed authoritative figure, was always good, saying, sure, yeah, medicine, good, doctors do what you want. Here's Tantawi ripping a veil off a woman's face, so that's just to give you pause about what a good mufti he was. Now, This discourse about good versus bad mufti is also circulated in international accounts about the Middle East. And so here we have a journalist from England who goes and travels in the Middle East, and he says, you know, if these Muslims don't get their act together, they're going to really fall behind progress. And so we have to really support the good muftis, like the ones who challenge orthodoxy's contention that the body belongs to God. It's a really ridiculous statement. Nobody is challenging orthodoxy's contention that the body belongs to God. In fact, to say the body belongs to God is a rather banal statement for a Muslim. It's like, well, yeah, duh, right? What do I do with that? How does that translate? That's the question. So here's my first debunking of the doctor versus sheikh argument. I find out doing my ethnography of Egypt that it's in fact a group of doctors who are blocking national legislation on brain death, not the religious scholars. So what are their arguments? They've got 4. One is that there's a biological continuation of life after the brain has stopped working. Okay, the cells are still working. Even if this is with the help of life respirating machines, the fact that there is a biological continuation of life makes them very easy. The second is that they believe that organ procurement is violating the dignity and respect of the dead, which actually, if that were the case, then it wouldn't even matter really if they're brain dead or just dead. The third is a justice issue. Are we allocating too much resources to these high-end technologies and not better spending them in preventative attempts to clean the water so people aren't predisposed to kidney failure in the first place? I would say that that's a good point, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question. And the fourth is that we're gonna fall into a slippery slope. And we already heard that. In the United States, brain dead donors are not an adequate supply. Brain dead and living donors not an adequate supply. And there is a slippery slope where people are widening the pool of who counts as an organ donor, including now people who have do not resuscitate statements whose hearts stop beating, right? Okay. So what's their proof of biological continuation of life? I know you're telling me I'm out of time. I don't know what to do. I'm not finished. Can I keep finishing? Yeah. Okay. So they say, look, these people get fevers. There's a Lazarus effect where they flail their arms around when procurement's happening. ICU people get really freaked out when that happens. And look, pregnant brain dead women can continue to nourish fetuses. That must be proof that this person is biologically alive. Okay. Their argument, what do they do with that? They say, this proves that the people of the West, now you can notice the political agenda of this doctor lobbyist group. The people of the West have told a lie. This is their argument, that the Muslims must stand against. And their lie is that this person is dead. And this person is clearly not dead because of all this biological evidence. Therefore, they must be lying for profit motives. Okay? That's the argument. Now, my analysis of this argument is, actually, let's look at what intensive care specialists in North Africa say about brain dead people. And how are they getting the proof that there's biological continuation of life? From North American medical journals. So in fact, there isn't a disagreement that there is biological continuation of life. Intensive care specialists in North America say, yes, there is, but they don't equate there being a biological continuation of life with whether the person or the soul is still there. So these intensive care specialists say, yeah, the person is in a sense actually still living. This is an interview that Margaret Locke does with 26 intensive care specialists. And they have a separation between mind and body. So they say this person is irreversibly gone. The person isn't there. The spirit is somewhere else. But the body is still working. That is the difference. The doctor group assumes that if there's anything biologically there, then the soul has to be there. Now, my argument as an anthropologist will be, you can't say one is more scientific than the other because science doesn't take the existence of the soul as object of inquiry. Okay, Leslie Sharp, Strange Harvest, now looks at the families of these North American donors. What's motivating them to give permission for doctors to procure organs from their brain dead family members? It turns out that they too often believe that their relative has not died until the moment of procurement of heart. So why would they allow for it? Well, often these are very violent deaths. They're sudden deaths because the body is good, but the brain has to be gone. So it's either violence, gunshot to the wound, suicide, or automobile accidents, which are the third. And because it's so sudden, they find difficulty making cultural meaning out of that death. And they make it through this idea that some good will happen elsewhere, okay? Now, if we contrast this to the Muslim case, it's very difficult for them to understand a difficulty elaborating the meaning of death and having to have that body part go into somebody else for death to be rendered meaningful, right? In Muslim traditions, there is a lot of elaboration, cultural elaboration about the meaning of death. And this is an example of a highway in Egypt where the road posts have one of the 99 names of God. And these are the automobile accident people off of these highways who come in. And my point is that the families can already have a very articulated reasoning for why that death occurs without having to turn to organ donation, recycling death, and making good somewhere else. Okay, I don't have time for all these stuff. Okay. So civilizational clash, that was a larger political issue going on at this time. The evil West, secularizing West, and our Muslim defenses weren't getting infiltrated by Western invasion, by Western militarization, by Western ethics, and that discourse got mapped onto and obfuscated the question of brain death. So people weren't able to adequately separate what the issues at stake were. Sheikh Ali Goma, who Sheikh Musa had talked about, when I did an interview with him, he was one of the only muftis who kept standing, was very uncomfortable with the idea of equating a brain-dead person with a cadaver. And the concerns that he raised were exploiting the marginalized. We have a disregard for the divine sovereignty. It's that moment of death. Now, I would, again, argue that these are all questions that are not necessarily intricately bound up with the question of brain death. If you're worried about the marginalized people, then you would have to put in a system that is attentive to that, so that there aren't a marginalized group that are getting exploited more than another. If you're worried about disregard for divine sovereignty or whether this is a desecration, then there has to be a way to address that. But it doesn't necessarily equate with disregarding brain death. Okay, I'm getting to the conclusions. But the question I want to ask is, we also have to be attentive to scale. So when people go and they ask the Grand Mufti, look at this man who is on a life respirator, his heart and his lungs, they're still moving. Is he dead? Is he the same thing as the corpse right there? And the Mufti looks at these two, and he says, now, if a person walks into the ICU with a gun and shoots the person who's brain dead, is that merely desecrating a corpse, or is that murder? And they said it's murder. And he said, well, then it's not the same thing, is it? Okay, he had a point. But the problem is then he gets faulted as Mufti for holding up the entire national legislative. So what was the scale of the problem that he was posed? Instead of asking him, yes, Sheikh Ali Goma, we have an entire nation of 85 million people. Hundreds of thousands of them are dying. Do you think it's permissible to actually sacrifice the lives of a few? This is the description of this life that will be sacrificed. This is a description of this life that could be lived. He might have come to a very different answer. So in conclusion, these are the questions that I think we have to ask. Who's assessing benefit of the medical intervention and on what basis? How is the scale of the intervention being defined? We can't ask the question case by case. You saw that with Imam Qazwini when he was asked, can we take that person off? He doesn't want to take that person off the life respirator when the family wants them to live. But if you ask him a large-scale question about resources that have to be managed equitably, it'll raise a bunch of different questions, right? And then have larger unresolved social or political issues like a civilizational clash been mapped onto a bioethical debate and thereby obfuscated what some of the major issues are? And how can we address the concerns of the marginalized? Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Dr. Hamdi, please don't think that this physician is trying to censor your input. So we talked about the different stakeholders in bioethics, and Dr. Hamdi's my evidence of why medical anthropology needs to be at the table whenever we have Islamic bioethics work groups. Another group or stakeholder that may need to be on the table is big bad pharma. And until now, we didn't really have pharmaceutical industry representation, but we will soon, as Dr. Ahsan Arozullah is the medical director and patient safety of medical director and patient safety director of Astellas Pharma Global Development. Before that, he was associate professor of internal medicine at University of Illinois Chicago, He served at the board of directors of Dialysis. He graduated at Northwestern University Medical School, trained in internal medicine there, and has a master's of public health in health service research.
That's okay. Pharma can do it themselves. There we go. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulihil ameen, assalamu alaikum. I gave Hamada that opening outside. That was not the introduction that he was given, so. But just for clarity, I'm not here as a representative of Astellas as a pharma company, but I am here primarily as a student of Dar al-Qasim, who's a co-sponsor of this conference. And as Hamada explained, the task I was given today was, again, in about 10 or 15 minutes, to cover the role of Muslim physicians in the bioethics discourse. And sort of tempered to my own background, I sort of added that subtitle there, and that what I'm going to try to present to you is a risk-benefit analysis. Hopefully something the physicians can relate to is, what are the risks and what are the benefits to having Muslim physicians at the table? So what's the background here? The background is that there are several roles that Muslim physicians play currently in this discourse. Some of that varies by where you happen to be on the globe, but in general, it usually comes down to either at an individual level, at a medical community level, or at an overall community level. So at an individual level, Muslim physicians often will serve as content experts. Some of them will even venture out to become authors of books. And the physicians will actually write, Muslim physicians will write books on specific biomedical ethical issues. On the consumer side, they're also a major consumer of this discourse. And I think you got a sense of some of the discontent from the physicians in terms of sort of disgruntled consumers that don't feel like they've gotten the products that they need. I'm not sure necessarily I agree with that position, but certainly that exists. On the medical community level, you have professional healthcare societies that often will produce documents that state certain healthcare ethical positions. Sometimes these will be in concert with or in opposition to more traditional juristic findings. And so again, I think this is a little bit more unique to Muslim professionals in the Western world. You do see some of this in the Muslim world, but much more in the Western world, where Muslim physicians probably feel that vacuum more and feel the need to fill that vacuum. So you may actually see them come out and make statements along these lines. And then at the community level, many of us have participated in our local and state ethics committees. And sometimes we're sort of the designated Muslim on that committee. So all things designated Islamic, certainly we're expected to be the expert on. My own background, again, so that you can take everything I say with a grain of salt in the interest of disclosure. My own training is really in clinical epidemiology and health services research. You won't see the word ethics on that slide, although I'd like to think that I have some ethics. I'm particularly interested, I've always been very interested in evidence-based medicine, evidence-based practice. And I sort of moved into the pharma world about 3.5 years ago out of academia into the world of drug safety, primarily because of an interest in applying epidemiological methods in the areas of safety signal detection, evaluation, risk management, and then ultimately in the area of benefit risk management. In the pharmaceutical world, the key thing we always ask about is what is the benefit risk of this particular drug for a particular patient or a particular population? And I'm going to apply some of those techniques to our discussion today. So if we think about benefit risk analysis, I'm going to go through these three subjects. The first one is Muslim physician participation in bioethics. What's the risk benefit there? The next is really to hone in on and drill down into what I consider to be the major risks. And again, being a drug safety guy, I'm always thinking safety first. And then to go a little bit deeper, to actually think about the actual definitions of the words benefit and risk. What do we mean when we say benefit in the context of a medical context? What do we mean by the word benefit and risk in an Islamic context? And sometimes we may be thinking that we're speaking the same language, but we may not be. So Muslim participation in bioethics. What are the benefits? Well, as Muslims, certainly we have an emotional attachment to the ideals of Islam. We feel that Islam has something to offer to this entire discourse, and because of that, we certainly emotionally feel driven to participate. I think at a deeper level, we do have a belief in the principles of Islam, and we want those principles to come forward into this discourse. As a physician, we bring to the table the ability to frame questions, and probably even more importantly, to provide specific context. And Sometimes this is part of the frustration of the physicians, is they don't believe that the questions being answered, I think, as you brought up, were actually framed correctly in terms of the rulings that are given back on the other side. But what are the risks? And I separate these in terms of Muslim and physician, not that we're all completely dichotomous, but it is a reasonable question to ask what part of us as Muslims and physicians are actually driven by the fact that we're physicians versus the part that's driven by the fact that we're Muslim. So as far as being a Muslim, I'd say that most of us, myself certainly included, suffer from insufficient knowledge. And often that insufficient knowledge with respect to understanding how an actual Islamic decision is come to, that lack of knowledge actually can lead us to misinterpret things. And I'll give you an example of how that might happen. I think also as a Muslim physician, sometimes we come to the table with an agenda. And that is that we, for example, what if we are a transplant surgeon? And we come to the table, ask a question about whether transplant surgery is okay or not. I think in an academic discourse or in a very sincere, honest way, we have to be careful that we leave our agenda at the door when we enter into this discourse. And I'm not sure we as physicians are always able to do that. As physicians, sometimes, and I was very impressed, and again, I didn't talk to Shireen before her talk, but this idea of the scale of the issue. The questions that seem to us to be incredibly important because we're faced with them every day may not in reality be that important. And we sort of do have sort of this self-imposed aggrandizement of ourselves, I think sometimes, that the questions that we come up with are particularly important. And the other problem is that answers, certainly as physicians, sometimes are driven by context instead of evidence. How many of us haven't maybe given a decision on a medical issue that's primarily driven by context but not by evidence? And we see that in healthcare practice all the time, that we're really driven by context. And again, as a Muslim physician, we have to be cautious that that doesn't become such a habit that we lose our ability to be objective, to actually step back for a moment and consider the idea that maybe the evidence leads us to an answer that we didn't come to the table with. And that's not easy to do. So what are the major risks for the Muslim physician when you go down this road? And I'd say they really come down, and again, trying to figure this out into 15 minutes, I had to pick 3 or 4, and these are 4 that really came to the forefront of my mind. The first risk is the definition of life. If you look on your pamphlet for this conversation, and we'll come through a slide that describes this, there's a distinct definition that we're using of life in the context of even this conference. That may or may not be the Islamic definition of what we consider to be life. And I'll go through what I mean by that. Another major risk is that there's differences in what we mean when we say the word evidence. What does evidence mean in an Islamic context? What does evidence mean in a medical context? The fact that we're so context-focused, we are context-driven by asking a question, and we're certainly context-driven in deriving that answer. And then what I call a fatwa-based assessment of what councils have actually come up with, or what jurists have actually come up with. That we sort of stop at the level of the fatwa, and I think we got a sample this morning of what might come into play. And again, putting my pharma hat, the analogy for me is that is trying to judge things based on what I call off-label use. Exceptions rather than the ultimate rule. So you can imagine this may be what the round table looks like tomorrow. And the problem is, sometimes in these conferences or in these discussions, we don't actually talk about the elephant in the room. And I think there's several elephants here that we should actually be explicit about. I'm not going to point out who's who at this table, but it looks like it could be here at Michigan. Let's think about the definition of the word life for a moment. So in medicine, we are really driven, and in all of our education as physicians, Muslim physician or non-Muslim physician, all of our education is really driven to understand life is really encompassing one distinct phase. Maybe we have some insight into before birth, and then we talk about life in this world. In Islamic ethics, life is defined in 3 distinct phases. You have a phase before you come to this world, a phase in this world, and you have a life in the afterlife. This fact that as a Muslim you have to incorporate this construct of life in an afterlife is a critical piece for the Muslim physician to consider. So even when we contextualize a question and we don't get an answer that we expect, this critical piece sometimes we, for some reason, forget this. That maybe the reason we're getting something isn't it doesn't always look easy for the life of this world, but it is because there's a benefit in the life hereafter, or there's a risk. Conversely, that there's a risk in the life hereafter. Again, something for us to balance and to think about. What is the standard that we usually use when we think about life? Well, we talk about improving quality of life and extending the length of life. Well, that makes sense for a physician. We want to improve the quality of someone's life. We want to treat comorbid conditions. We want someone to be healthier, to be happier, all of these things. And then we also want to extend the length of the life. As a society, we take great pride when the life expectancy of the society goes up. We show that as a sign that our healthcare system is actually doing something productive. Well, in Islamic ethics, you may use the same constructs. You may say we also want to improve quality of life. But that life that's being used there has to encompass all three phases. It cannot be exclusive, and it cannot be to the exclusion of improving life in the afterlife. Because if you do, maybe you're not actually improving the quality of somebody's life. And that's certainly something that we should, as Muslim physicians, pause and think about from time to time. Then when we think about the issue of end-of-life care, and this is where I refer to our pamphlet, on the title of that we say it's end-of-life care. Well, for the Muslim ethicist and the Islamic ethicist, what we're really talking about on that pamphlet is end of this life in this world care. No one's presuming that at the end of this life, for the Muslim ethicist, that life is over. So what you're really doing, and it's funny that even on the pamphlet for an Islamic bioethics conference, we use the term end of life, because in a medical context, that's what we are to understand. And again, I'm not trying to nitpick, I'm just trying to raise these issues in your minds to say that, these are considerations for the Muslim physician if they really want to go down this road to engage in this discourse. How do we think about evidence? Now, this is my favorite topic, right? In medicine, we look at case series, we look at observational studies, we look at randomized control trials. We have distinct methods that we use for weighing evidence. Well, evidence in Islamic ethics, depending on which point of view you come from, but to a large extent, to summarize, it really comes down to evidence is primarily revelation. And revelation either through the Quran and Sunnah, and again, I don't have the qualification to go into the details of that, but the idea that evidence there refers to revelation versus what we're used to thinking about as evidence, again, it's a moment of pause for the Muslim physician. How qualified am I as a Muslim physician through my medical training and perhaps my Sunday school training in Islam to really understand revelation? How much of my life have I spent studying revelation to appreciate it, to understand it, to be able to derive principles, derive hukam, and so on? Distinguishing that expertise in our minds is important. Applying the methods for weighting evidence, we still have that same idea in Islamic ethics. There are methods by which we weigh evidence, but those methods may not be the way that we do. We may give great weight to a randomized control trial that's done, because we're familiar with that. We know how to weigh evidence. In the other world, in that world of Islamic ethics, we may not have a great sense of how to weigh evidence. So on the surface of it, it may look to us that there's no justification for this ruling. It doesn't make sense because the weight of the evidence doesn't make sense in our construct, through our lens. Is there consistency? That's what we look for in medical evidence. Is there consistency across different types of trials? Do we see it across different populations? Well, and then we also talk about this idea of causality, that there's a certain threshold that we cross in medical knowledge that then we attribute something to something else. In basic epidemiology, right, we have these basic criteria that we go through. Is something causally related? Well, there's a certain amount of evidence that you have to cross before you get to that line. In Islamic ethics, it may take time for us to get used to this idea, but to some extent, evidence is a little bit more static. It's not necessarily moving all the time. And again, I'll try to expound on why I think the evidence is a little bit more static than it is certainly compared to medicine. The idea that evidence evolves and that over time we actually get closer to the truth, that's something that we buy as physicians. We think that as time goes by, we know more. As Muslim physicians, again, we ought to pause and say, as Muslims, do we actually believe that? Do we actually think that as time goes by that we're closer to the truth, or are we further from the truth? And I'll leave that question for you to hopefully ponder about. But I'm not convinced necessarily that as a Muslim, we definitely would always buy the argument that as time passes, that we as human beings get closer to the truth. One may actually argue that sometimes we get further from it. And again, in Islamic ethics, we have this idea that context evolves, and there's no doubt about that, that requires application of evidence, but that evidence in and of itself may not have changed. And then you apply that evidence to a new circumstance. In the use of context, in medicine, we use context to generate a question, we use it to frame a question, we use it to determine the answer, and then we use it to apply the answer. Patient comes in front of us, we take a history, we make an assessment, and then we determine what to treat them with. All of that process is very contextual. If we're a really good physician, we may actually incorporate some evidence, if we happen to have read a study maybe a week ago. But in general, this is exceedingly contextual. and study after study will show this, that in general, physicians will practice the way that they practiced at the time they graduate from their residency. It's very difficult to educate somebody later on in life. I'm hoping that's not always the case, but in Islamic ethics, you may generate the question based on context. We as a physician may go to an Islamic scholar and say, we've generated a question based on the context. We may frame that question, but the answer itself, there is a step where that mufti or that scholar will go off, maybe into a dark room, maybe go away for 2 weeks, and ponder about that question. Go through their books, think about the evidence. That process, that pause, that process is independent of the context that I drove the question from. They may come back with that answer, and then they may apply that answer in a fatwa. Then again, they may incorporate the context. But there is this one step that is independent of context. And again, I think that's important for the Muslim physician to appreciate, that when a scholar doesn't give you an answer immediately to a question, maybe they also need a little bit of time to ponder on it. Maybe they need to go back to their evidence. They need to think about it. But again, they need to do that independent of a context. Fatwa-based review, 1 or 2? 1. Oh, goodness. Okay. In very simple terms, if you were, as a physician, to decide whether a drug has efficacy or safety based on off-label use, so physicians are using a drug in a certain way and you study that pattern, and from that you derive your idea that this drug works for ABC, then again, you may be able to provide some useful information, but the fundamental flaw in your thinking is that you've been misled with regard to establishing a best practice. If you're going to establish a policy of what that drug is best for, you best better go with the label, because that's actually where the best studies were done. That's why that drug is labeled for that. The analogous thing happens to the Muslim physician when they only study fatwa. If you look at a fatwa-based review based on individual cases, we don't always appreciate that those particular rulings were based on a contextualization of a particular hukum, of a particular answer. And if we don't go back to appreciate what that hukum is, we may actually base policy on an off-label use without really understanding what the hukum was. And that's really the risk. So what would that look like? Well, let's take the example of organ transplant. Let's say, for example, that there's a fatwa allowed, but that fatwa that was allowed was an exception for a secondary consideration, and it's not really reflective of the whole evidence that really is based on and that fatwa doesn't tell you that this was only based on a secondary consideration. But the primary evidence in that fatwa actually raises some doubt. So it's been contextualized for a particular circumstance, we're going to allow it. Now, if you decide, and if you only study that fatwa, you may surmise that it is allowed, and then this is the dangerous part. And not only is it allowed, but that it reflects the totality of the evidence, and that is a false assumption. And then based on that false assumption, you may actually lead to the impression that now an obligation actually exists. That not only is organ transplant okay, but because it's okay, it's also obligatory. So you've created an obligation that never really existed. And that also is a horrendous thing to do. So again, a caution to the Muslim physician who's going to dabble in Islamic bioethics. Definitions of benefit and risk, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the bottom line is, the key thing I wanted to bring out here is that when we talk about risk in a medical sense, we have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about. We may use the word harm or whatever it is. In Islamic ethics, we're talking about sin. That may be the terminology that's used. So if someone is talking about the word sin, how do you bring that into a common or a secular discussion? That is a big challenge for the Muslim physician to incorporate. What does it mean when someone tells you that something is sinful? How do you interpret that? And how do you bring that into play? But certainly that has to be a consideration if you're going to try to sit at this table. So what is the overall benefit risk? I think there are definitely benefits to the Muslim physician being part of this. One benefit is you get to come speak at conferences like this. I do think there is some weight that should be given in the fact that as a Muslim physician we have an emotional attachment to a psalm. I don't think that should be underrated. I'm not meaning that in a pejorative way. I'm actually saying that's a good thing. And I think that as a physician we do have the ability to frame questions and provide context. But what we don't have the ability to do, and I think we need to be perfectly honest about this, is we don't necessarily have the qualifications to define life. We don't necessarily appreciate the subtleties and differences in evidence. We are exceedingly context-focused as physicians, and that may be a hazard in this sort of conversation. And we tend to base our assessments on fatwa and off-label use, and I think sometimes we make some fundamental mistakes in our thinking. And I think we also have a risk in the actual definitions of what we understand to be a risk here. What are some other roles for Muslim physicians? I'm not trying to make the argument that we shouldn't be at the table or we shouldn't have a participatory role, but I do think we, as Muslim physicians, need to think a little bit more broadly about what is our role in the overall ethical discourse. One is in the ethics of professionalism. What do we as Muslim physicians understand about what it means to be a professional? Have we as Muslim professionals, we have thousands of Muslim physicians, is the practice of medicine in America different because Muslims practice it here? And if the answer is no, then we probably have some work to do. A patient advocacy focus. Is there a larger ethical issue? That the fact that some of our patients can't actually pay for the care that we want to provide, is that a more important ethical issue for us to spend our time dealing with than a one-off or two-off contextualization of a problem that may not nearly be as broad? Maybe that's where our focus should be. The chance to learn, and this is a huge emphasis for me, is that as Muslim physicians, we shouldn't see this as someone telling us that we don't know anything. Again, my intent is to encourage us to learn more. And I think that's where the fun is. I think that's where the excitement is for us to engage in learning about these things in a lot more detail than perhaps we've done in the past. And lastly, I think a role for us is to serve in partnerships with our Islamic scholars. Not in opposition to them, but in partnership with them. They need us to be able to say things honestly, but not necessarily come to the table with an agenda. And vice versa, we need them to meet us at the table so that we can hopefully come to good decisions. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, thank you, Dr. Arozullah, for those moments of pause and keeping Muslim physicians humble. We'll push through with Dr. Farkurlan. Fortunately, those of us who work on clinical ethics are very familiar with his work. He is Associate Professor of Medicine and Co-Director of the Program of Medicine and Religion at the University of Chicago, and he's done extensive work in this field. For the interest of time, I'm going to... I'm sorry?
No slides.
Oh, no slides. Okay, great. Okay, so
Well, it's I had the privilege of going to a lot of conferences in my work, and I have to say this has been the most interesting conference so far that I've been to in a long time. I think part of what's so refreshing to me is the tenor of the conference shows that those both speaking and in attendance are serious about trying to understand how we ought to live, how we ought to practice. There's not just an exercise in a sort of academic play on different concepts. And I'm going to improvise my talk. I'll stick to my few minutes, but improvise because so much has been said this morning that has been said well that I can reduce my comments a bit and comment on some of those things that have been said. And I'm going to start with Professor Brody's talk, which was a terrific, I think a terrific introduction. And in it, he talked about both the power and some of the critiques of the Rawlsian framework for thinking about how we enter into public conversation with each other in a plural world, a morally plural world, to discern how we should order our common life together. And it strikes me that to me, the weakness that's most palpable in my sense of the Rawlsian framework is the construct of the personal and the professional, or the public and the private. The public and the private, I guess, is the more primary, as two clearly distinguishable spheres. As Professor Brody noted, the boundaries between these spheres are always contested, as are between the religious and the secular. But it seems to me the contesting of the boundary between the public and the private, or with respect to medicine, the personal and the professional, is really important. What we haven't really heard this morning is a lot of conversation about, well, this is my private view, but of course over here I'm a professional and I keep those separate. That's not been a part of the conversation. I find that refreshing, and I'll describe why in a moment. I'm talking about what religion has to do with the practice of medicine. There's been quite a bit of attention in the United States to what religion has to do with patients' health, both as a factor, a sociological health related factor that may impact outcomes, but as well to how patients experience illness. But yet even in the cultural competency literature, which is one of the literatures in medicine, physicians are often portrayed, in contrast to the very unique and interesting and diverse patients, physicians are portrayed as sort of generic representatives of biomedical science, of a medical profession. And it seems to me that, as we've seen some this morning, that doesn't really do justice to the reality that physicians themselves come to medicine with all their own particularity. And being Muslim or having a serious commitment to Islam obviously would be one of those interesting, unique sort of aspects. And I'm going to consider what religion has to do with medicine by comparing and contrasting to what science has to do with medicine, because science, I think, it seems more obvious in our culture that science has a lot to do with medicine. Now, no one ever asks what science has to do with medicine, any more than they would ask what books have to do with learning or what tools have to do with carpentry. Science is what makes medicine work. As a result of modern science, people in developed nations now live twice as long as they did 100 years ago, and they live with much less disability. Yet for all the contributions of science to medicine, clinicians must look elsewhere to find their motivation and direction. In a way, medicine would never get off the ground without functionally religious ideas, because medicine requires a motivation to care for the sick. Science has provided vast knowledge about how we might care for the sick, but science is silent about why we ought to care for the sick. And as we've heard this morning, religions are not. It's not incidental that the concept of a hospital began when monastic communities enfolded the care of the sick into their lives of liturgy and prayer. Religions often ground the care of the sick in sacred and transcendent obligations to God and neighbor. And that's not to say that those who think of themselves as irreligious lack the motivation to practice medicine. Our common experience proves otherwise. But it is to say that clinicians need to draw on some sort of functionally religious idea to at least be able to make sense, to explain why caring for the sick is a good and worthy activity. Sheikh Musa this morning talked about teachings that animate for Muslim physicians the practice of medicine, a commitment to preserve life and to preserve the body, to ward off harms, the preservation of health, and so on. Those are not just adopted from a general secular framework, although that is an area of a lot of agreement among religious traditions and secular traditions. But those are explicitly part of the teaching of Islam. Clinicians derive their motivation to care for the sick from a variety of sources, but it doesn't come from science. Science is just neutral regarding that. Indeed, the practice of medicine is a bit of a puzzle for the overarching framework through which so many scientists make sense of human behavior, namely Darwinian evolutionary theory, and specifically evolutionary psychology. There could hardly be a practice less conducive to the reproductive fitness of a population than spending enormous resources caring for the sick, the deformed, the weak, the aged, those who either have no capacity to contribute to the gene pool because they're infertile, or whose contributions to that pool will reduce population fitness. So natural selection and the physician appear to be at cross purposes. One works to eliminate the sickly, the other to save them from elimination. Now, medicine is not only animated by something like a religious vision, but it also requires a thick moral framework for its ongoing direction. And we've heard some of that framework from the traditions within Islam this morning. So to know how to care for patients, we need to know something about what makes human flourishing entails, how medicine contributes to it. Medical science is less helpful here than one might hope. It does help us to better understand the empirical world, and therefore helps us all refine our efforts to bring about human flourishing. It shows a range of technical possibilities and provides information about what we can reasonably expect as the consequence of choosing one course over another. But even the successes of medical science highlight its limitations. As medical science generates technologies that can be put to ever wider uses, it exposes disagreements about which of those uses are worthwhile. And to pick up on Hassan's rhetorical question, science as it progresses allows us to know both more and less, in the sense, more about what's possible, less, that introduces more confusion about what we ought to do, at least often does. Although medicine proceeds in scientific ways in the care of patients, it does so in pursuit of goals that science can't set, and these goals come from moral traditions and cultures, whether they're religious or otherwise. And in the same way that the influence of a dominant culture on medical practice is often invisible or taken for granted precisely because of its dominance, The influence of religious ideas on medical practice is often invisible in those areas where commitments are shared among different religions and other moral traditions. For example, we generally take it for granted that mending injuries, treating infections, and removing diseased organs are good things to do. That's because the moral commitments that undergird those practices are shared by virtually all moral communities, religious or otherwise. Moral commitments that are shared don't really seem moral at all. They don't seem personal in that sense. The influence of religion on medical practice becomes more visible where the commitments of one tradition diverges from those of another or from the values of the dominant culture, and I'm just going to say we've heard a lot about that this morning, and we can think particularly about the care of patients at the end of life or with very diminished health. I do think, however, that those are tips of an iceberg. Beneath that are disagreements regarding really fundamental questions about what it means to take care of someone, to fulfill our obligation to take care of our neighbor, what it is that we hope for in the face of death, and so on. In the end, for all that's hoped for in scientific and evidence-based practice, clinicians must ultimately act as practical moral philosophers, making judgments about how best to pursue the goals of medicine for a particular patient in a particular context. And I will say here that I think one of the interesting questions for me today in listening to this is to what extent physicians can come to be something like how do they move from strictly just a layperson to a sort of mufti of some clinical capacity, within their own area of expertise, because clinicians have to make these kinds of decisions all the time. And how do they do that without becoming presumptuous about what they know? The third area where religions substantially, I think, impact the practice of medicine, and here I'm just going to sort of state this and maybe leave it for question and answer time if you want to explore it further, is in developing the practices that help physicians become the sort of physicians they know they ought to be. Patients have forever complained with good reason that physicians tend to treat them as objects and rather than as the persons they are. And that, it seems that physicians fall prey to a very human tendency to kind of not take as seriously other people as we take ourselves. We're busy, other people are different, and we don't tend to think about their own internal experiences like we do our own. And that can lead us to treat them as objects rather than as persons. What religions generally do is form their people in practices. I mean, there was a prayer time over the lunch hour. That practice of prayer shapes a person's consciousness, shapes them bodily in their habits to keep them attending to truths that would otherwise be ignored. And I think that influence within medicine, we should at least explore how that might be actually very salutary for the profession of medicine, that its practitioners would have space to continue those practices that form them as members of their religious community, as followers of God, but at the same time also animate their practice of medicine in a way that will benefit patients. And with my 1 minute, let me make a couple of comments, again, kind of swinging back to the subject that Professor Brody and Professor Vischer talked about. This private versus public sphere, it seems to me, is clearly contested all the time in the area of medicine. And we take a simple example, which is this issue of conscientious refusals, which Professor Vischer talked about a bit. In conscientious refusals, where a physician or other healthcare worker refuses to provide something that's legal and that patients request, often the assertion is made, or the claim is made, or the argument is made, that what's happening there is the physician or healthcare provider is allowing their personal values to be imposed upon what should be the professional sphere. Very similar to they're allowing their private world to kind of come where it's not welcome, which is into that public sphere. And yet, it seems to me that what's going on there almost always is in fact not so much a bringing of a private into a clearly public, but a dispute about what the commitments are of that professional role. So with respect to reproductive technologies, there's a dispute about whether medicine properly includes the use of this technology or that in this situation and that. And when someone uses the maneuver of, well, you got to keep your private values out, that can feel like a power move, a kind of arbitrary power move that avoids that really sincere disagreement about the content or the substance of those professional commitments. That can lead to frustration, it seems to me, for believers, and to a kind of incoherence where they're trying to act like they're keeping these separate when they're really not. And it kind of, in a way, cuts off the sort of civility, which I agree with Professor Brody is a crucial public virtue that we have to develop to learn to live together peaceably with these sincere disagreements, because that civility requires that we at least be able to give people space for that free exercise of religion and a space to talk about that. So I think here's the challenge. I'll close with this. In medicine, to the extent we maintain this notion of a clearly distinguishable private and public or personal and professional, we tend to create a kind of go along with, it seems to me, a false sense that these can be kept separate. And what that does is it prevents the practitioners from explicitly making sense of how these are actually come together. And if they're not able to make sense of that, then they can't really live into the practice of medicine in a really vocational sense, as a way of living a good and faithful life, and serving their neighbor, and serving God. And it seems to me that although there are dangers and downsides, risks and benefits, again to use Hassan's metaphor, to having physicians self-consciously practicing from many different traditions in a kind of self-conscious relation to their religious beliefs, that there are risks to shutting that off as well, and that it seems to me that we ought to push that boundary back a bit and at least try to work out peaceable practices of medicine that invite physicians to make sense of this connection between who they are as a religious believer and who they are as a physician, and to care for patients in that really vocational sense, in a public, speaking publicly about what they're doing and helping explain that to others. It seems like it would enrich their own experience, and it would enrich the public sphere and the professional sphere of medicine at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers for your talks. I think we're out of time. In fact, we ran a little bit over. Can we take any questions? 2:20 is great. Okay, so we can have questions. Okay. We have 3:20? 10 minutes, okay. Any questions? And after you give your question, please, you can return to your seat so we can keep the flow of the line. Sorry.
Thanks for the wonderful panel discussion. In the context of the ethnography of the Egyptian patient population, do you find, as far as the doctor-patient relationship and going into this public-private sphere, I find that in the United States, as far as a healthcare practitioner, we're very isolated, or many of us are so subspecialized that we're isolated from the day-to-day trials and tribulations of a patient. And I was wondering if that, again, extrapolates into the concept of that physicians or caretakers here don't get into the private sphere enough of their patients, and two, is that physicians don't come in at least disclaiming where they're coming from. So I just wanted to, just maybe get an idea of bringing in that cultural context to what the doctor-patient relationship is. And a lot of our ethical issues are, the doctor knows best, especially in third world countries, or they'll do anything that doctor says. Whereas now we have this information age where you're empowering patients and healthcare practitioners. But when do you bring in your personal viewpoint? Because I personally think I'd like to know where that person is coming from that's going to be treating me.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, in the Egyptian context, because it's so religiously homogeneous, and of course 10% of Egyptians are Coptic Christians, and they tend to go to Coptic doctors. I mean, it's not always the case. And Muslim, not always, but there is some kind of religious similarity often between patient and physician. So the physician often feels entitled to argue with the patient and say, why do you think this is haram? It's not haram. And to convince the patient. And That's why I think it's also important to look at some of these sort of like ethical dilemmas of the physicians themselves. And so I look at, for example, with the brain death, there was a case that just really stuck with me, and it was a young anesthesiologist in the ICU, and he came out and he was so devastated because there were a bunch of patients who were all dying around the same time. And at one instance, one of them's heart, stops, and so he starts to resuscitate, and he's a resident, and the attending says to him, "Haram! That person is trying to die. Let him die. Why do you keep resuscitating?" And so he stops, and then the next attending comes to him and says, "Haram! Save him! Why aren't you resuscitating him?" And he was doing this. And I think that because there aren't enough conferences to really work out these issues, sometimes the doctors are confused among themselves. And I mean, I think there's even another level of abstraction once you get to the religious scholars who have no idea what it's like to be in the ICU and just can't even imagine what they're talking about.
Just a brief comment on that. Thankfully, although there are obviously very important disagreements and differences among the different communities, there is, fortunately, it's not all up in the air. So patients don't have, they're not going to go see someone and just have an entirely different practice depending on their tradition. There's a lot that's shared, but it seems to me that because there is on the margins of medicine, and those margins are substantial, because there is no professional agreement about a lot of different practices, it does seem like physicians should cultivate practices and the capacity to, in a candid and respectful way, explain why his or her counsel might be different from someone else, what someone else's would be. So that takes a lot of self-consciousness, takes a little thinking about how one situates oneself within the broader community of professionals, and it takes I think, a practice of being respectfully candid about where you're coming from.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, I would just say that also there is a potential danger of mistaking somebody's opinion about a medical procedure and thinking that it's because of religion, when in fact it has to do with access and efficacy. And people aren't always able to articulate which thing it is. And so it's really hard, it's really important to distill just keep asking, what is it exactly that's bothering you about this procedure?
So thank you again for the excellent panel. I'm a Muslim physician who treats a variety of different segments of society as well as different ethnicities and religions. And how does one balance their own religious identity against their American identity of trying to accept all these different cultures and finding a common ground? And in the way I was taught medicine on this campus was you allow the patient to help make the decision, and you're just a surrogate or a guide for that patient. But then when I start adding my own religious values, which I think are very helpful in my commitment to the field, does that compromise my Americanness? And so,
It's interesting. We found in my research, with mine and my research done with colleagues, that physicians from religious communities that are less represented in the United States, which includes Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism, because those are the ones we have enough people respond to surveys to make some inferences about them, are more likely to endorse the notion that they try to keep their religious beliefs and their professional practices separate, and that they accommodate the things that the patients request. So I think people are struggling, it seems like. I mean, this is survey research. It's limited. I don't want to overstate it, but there seems to be some struggle to try to be accommodating in a culture where you're a small minority. I would not want to be trying to prescribe the best way to deal with that. But it does seem to me that that's a real challenge that people face.
I'm not clear where the conflict is, frankly. So I think the Muslim physician should embrace the idea that their Islam will actually make them a better physician. And I don't think they should shy away from it. I think it is very possible to practice as a Muslim physician to try to be true to that tradition. I think that takes a lot of work. I don't by any means claim that I've figured it out, but I certainly think that takes a lot of work. I think it should be sincere. And I think the result of that, dealing with patients of different backgrounds, Growing up as a Muslim in this country, you've done that your whole life, if I had to presume. So I'm not sure the practice of your medicine is going to not relate to that, or that you're not going to be capable of doing that. So I actually find that there's very little conflict here. The question I think that you might be thinking or struggling with is, if I have an Islamic value that is in opposition to what my patient's value is, and they ask me for advice on a question, what is my obligation? If that's where you're going, I think that's a little bit trickier. And that's a little bit, but I think if that person in front of you is not Muslim, your obligation is to advocate as best you can what that patient's wishes are. And again, if it gets to the point where it violates your principle, then we consult the legal professor this morning, I guess, to see if we have a case. That was a joke.
Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank you all for yet another really wonderful panel discussion. In light of what Dr. Ehsan was talking about other roles of healthcare providers in terms of patient advocacy and professionalism, I was wondering if any or all of you might address the question of promoting caring and compassion and presence in these days of assembly line, highly technological medicine, where often we are super specialized.
Well, I'll
a
say
great
something
question.
maybe provocative to the doctors here, but I
Like we
actually,
haven't already.
well, I don't know why one person has to be everything. And I mean, I'm just thinking of the days when my own father had terminal brain cancer, and we wanted the most excellent neurosurgeon, and I don't see why we can't why he also has to be every kind of caring I mean, I want him to really focus in on the brain and not be distracted, and then have other people who that's their strength. I mean, when I think about those hospice nurses as a Muslim, I think paradise must lie under the feet of hospice workers because of what they do, and I saw that. And there are people who have a particular virtue, a particular personality, who are driven towards very caring and very present work. And there are people who are more technical and might excel in that. And given that we have this diversity that we can draw on in community, I think people can take on different tasks, and we shouldn't expect the doctor, the specialist, to do everything.
And here I would say, and I completely agree that may be the possibility in terms of specialty, but I think the onus is on the Muslim physician to be the best possible physician. And the way you do that is to be the best possible Muslim. And so a simple example of what you're describing is on class on Sunday, where Sheikh Amin teaches us. He brought up the point that in the Sunnah we have the idea that when someone addresses you, that you have to turn to face them. Now, I mean, in my practice, all of you probably use electronic medical records. Half the time you're typing, you're not facing the patient. So even that common decency is in our Sunnah. So it's not about whether you're a physician or not. It's just how much have you actually exemplified that Sunnah. I think there should be tremendous confidence for the Muslim that if we actually go back there, it will be very natural for us to be exceedingly good physicians. Now, again, I'm not saying that's an easy task, but I certainly agree with your point. I do think that's someplace that Muslim physicians need to go. We need to ask ourselves these tough questions. Are we really the best physicians that we can be? And it's not easy, and most of the time, I know personally, the answer is not.
Just would comment briefly that I think this is, again, a place where practices of religious spiritual formation can be helpful, because in a way, in order to do that, to really attend to the patient, which is maybe not necessary for the neurosurgeon, because they can attend to the tumor, but most medical care, if you're going to do it well, requires a balancing of it in hundreds of different values and concerns and applying them to a particular person's situation. And to do that well, you have to really pay attention to them and listen to them. And that requires a kind of resistance to all your natural impulses to get going, to get done, to be, all those sorts of things that is the spiritual disciplines help you develop the capacity to resist.
Unfortunately, I think I got the sign that this panel has been now and is terminal, and so we have to end. We can no longer accept someone pulled the plug.
It's too much